So in my private practice, a lot of people, I worked with people from all stratospheres. And so some people had very little to buy groceries each week, and others had unlimited budgets. I saw people heal on the lower quality proteins and fats all the time. So I don't want anyone to ever feel discouraged that because of their budget or because of the difficulty they can't get better, or that they have to get a certain kind of food. There are individuals that are more sensitive, right? Michaela Peterson would be a very good example. They definitely are out there and more. So what I always recommend is just go lower toxin if you're trying to reduce while you're educating yourself and learning about this, because it's fascinating, I think. So as you do that, go more towards the meats, and if you do okay with dairy and the egg, that'll automatically lower your toxin load. Then you can learn about the rest. But in general, the fattier that the animal product is, the more important it is that you know the source. So when I'm working with someone with a really tight budget, but maybe not, maybe just a little bit flexible, we'll get the good quality fat, because the fat is where all mammals and most animals store their toxins, right? We think of fat as this character flaw, that we've eaten too much and exercised too little. But that is not the purpose of a fat cell. A fat cell is very protective. It grows to protect the organs. It's actually indicative of someone who's pretty healthy in an unhealthy environment. So their body is adapting by creating those fat cells. And what those fat cells do is, one of the things they do is to store toxins while the liver is overburdened. So when the liver is overburdened from filtering all those fat soluble toxins, it's going to create those. Now, that does not address lectins. Those go through the kidneys, but that's semantics. So the other ones do, the rest of them do. So essentially, the higher fat it is, the better to have a clean source. So if you're getting butter, or if you're getting lard, it would be great to get like a milk-fed lard or a hazelnut-fed lard, right? One of these top shelf items, right? Something that a chef would want. And then if you have extra left over, let's say you're getting a ribeye, a fatty cut, that would be good. Same with salmon. Salmon, you really do. I would say fish, if it's not very lean, you really want it as clean as you can get, because the farm fish are eating very unnatural food and high toxin food for our immune system. And so when you have that, then you can start looking at some of the leaner things. But I would say things like shrimp or pork tenderloin or chicken breast, those are less important to get perfect. The higher fat, the more.
And when somebody wants to go for most nutrient dense, I know there's a whole continuum within the carnivore realm, people that are just having beef, people that are pro and against organs, and then there's, fish and chicken and all the different meats and pork. How do you look at all that from a nutrient standpoint?
As a practitioner, I always just work with what I can with each person, because when people are as sick as my clients tend to be, you don't always have a choice. They may do well with one and not the other. So we go with what we can get into the person. But in terms of in a dream world, if I could just choose, I would definitely have pork high up there, because right now we have a lot of cytokine illnesses, and pork happens to be very high in B1, which regulates cytokines, along with helps the mitochondria process oxalates. It does all sorts of wonderful things, remyelinates the nerves, very important. And we really don't have it in our diets. So we're very deficient in that already, and we have a lot of foods that block it. But if I could only pick one, it would honestly be red meat. Red meat is one of the few things, so aside of beef, it's one of the few things that I could put you on a desert island with and give you nothing else for the rest of your life but a steak every single day, and you would be healthier than you've ever been. We don't have other foods like that. We can't do that if I feed you with rabbit or with chicken, anything else. You start to get, over a long period of time, you can get deficiencies, especially in things like vitamin A. So red meat would be my favorite. Now, the organs are phenomenal. Absolutely phenomenal. And really some of the organs that aren't as consumed even in these kind of new ancestral communities are fabulous and are very much in all the blue zones and also all the indigenous regions that I go to with such good health. So the organs are very important, but it's not as sterilized as we tend to have it, right? We tend to be like, okay, I'm going to have this organ and nothing else. so, so we'll have, a plate of organs, and that's not the ancestral way. The ancestral way would be to have a little bit of all the organs, along with the gelatinous tissue and the skin and everything else. And so it's all kind of consumed by the family or the community together and shared, rather than a hyper focus. That's not to say that a hyper focus can't be beneficial. Foods can be used medicinally in all of these cultures. So you may have an uptick of a certain food for a certain illness, but in general, it's not consumed the way that I'm seeing.
Well, let's get really practical with the organ piece. For somebody that wants to embrace that as part of their diet, you mentioned the diversity, and how do you recommend somebody over in the West to get them in on a regular basis, get a wide array, and not overdo it? I'm assuming, even a good thing like organ meats, we can do too much. So let's get practical and talk about how you recommend somebody incorporate those.
So I'll usually start with the easiest ones. And I'll often, because so many of us are not used to seeing where our food is really from, at least in America, right? So I will usually have them contact a butcher and have the butcher mix in organ meats with their ground beef or ground chicken or anything else. And I'll usually start with heart, because heart is a muscle. So it tastes the most like meat. It has the least organy kind of flavor. So we'll usually start with that. That's full of coenzyme Q10 and all sorts of good things, especially for energy and things that are really needed when you're very ill. So that can be very, very helpful. From there, then I'll kind of spread out based on what the person is dealing with. If someone has a chronic immune deficiency, right? If we're dealing with like an AIDS or someone who has cancer, that's also immune deficiency, or a chronic illness where they tend to get sick every 1 to 3 weeks, right? With whatever's going around, then we'll do thymus. We'll go to the glands for that. The thymus gland is really amazing for that. It's very well studied. And in fact, for people that are sick, they're often prescribed a prescription form of thymic protein A. So that can be really beneficial. Now, it's becoming a bit easier now to get some of the more obscure things. I used to have to really become close friends with someone who owned cattle or other animals to be able to get things like the adrenal gland, the hypothalamus, the thyroid, some of the smaller glands. But those are real powerful when needed, when someone really needs those. So those can be very good. But in general, I start mixing it into the ground meat because most people are kind of intimidated and afraid and not into the flavor. And once they start to get used to it, we don't have to do as much prep. For instance, if someone is just starting with liver, we'll usually bread the liver. We'll use Parmesan or something else to bread it with. And then cook it in tons of fat and onions and all these flavors, right? And then once they get used to it, they don't need any of that. And so it becomes much easier to consume and to prepare and all of that.
And how do you feel about organs and otherwise cooking methods and different nutrition? So I've heard of different people consuming organs raw. We have capsule form. You mentioned here, breading and cooking up liver, putting it in ground beef or ground meat, which is going to be cooked. How does that change things when you start to cook it?
Oh, that's a great question. So every region that I go to prepares the organs a little bit differently very often. Some will do more raw, some will do more cooked, and it often depends on which one. Like the liver is most often raw. I can't think of a time where I've seen it cooked. That one is raw. Often the kidneys are raw as well, but things like the lungs tend to be cooked, the brain tends to be cooked. A very short poaching for things that are kind of gelatinous like that, like soft. So the brain, the lungs, those get a quick poaching or a quick cook over the fire, but not cooked as long as the meat. So it's not chewy and dry and flavorless. So the cooking method really affects the flavor and how you're going to like it. I mean, very drastically so, especially if you haven't been raised with it. But most of these communities that I go to really do those things quite right. They just do light cooking. With things like fish liver, so in Greece, you can get monkfish liver, which is one of my favorite foods, and it's a hard one to get. And that you just sear it on each side very lightly, very quickly, like an ahi tuna. You can also eat that raw, but it's so delectable. when you sear it. So that's a really good way to go. There are a few regions that will put it kind of all in together as a soup, but those tend to be regions where they already ate when they caught the animal or they slaughtered the animal, and so they're not eating it fresh. And they do one-pot cooking methods. I think so often we're very intimidated when we go from maybe living a kind of modern American life or modern wherever you're from life. And then we get sick and we suddenly realize, oh, I have to learn how to do this and I need to cook from scratch and all these kinds of things. But what I've really taken away from all of my travels is that you really only need one pot and a knife. If you have a pot and a knife, you can eat like traditional folks. So they cook very simply and very easily, but it's very tasty. And so, I personally went from just having the most extensive, fabulous kitchen. I do miss that kitchen, to now I feel great as long as I have some place to heat up a pot. I can cook really good food. So you start to learn that it doesn't have to take over your whole life to do many of these diets and make these changes. It's actually about doing less than doing more.
If you enjoyed that clip, press here for the full episode. I'll see you over there.
What the Blue Zone is selling fits with the narrative of what we've heard really since the food pyramid and promotes that further. We tend to be like, okay, I'm going to have this organ and nothing else. That's not the ancestral way. The ancestral way would be